Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is Season 2, Episode 20, Newbery Medal Winners. The Newbery Medal is widely considered to be the most prestigious award for children's literature, alongside the Caldecott Medal for picture books. The Newbery Medal has been awarded every year since 1922 by the American Library Association, and the winners are widely known and read in schools. If you look down the list of winners, odds are you read at least a few of them when you were in elementary school. I think the award sticker has come to mean a sort of shorthand for quality literature. Although I should clarify that the award is specifically for American literature. You won't see Harry Potter on the list, for example. Of course, this concept of quality literature also cuts both ways. Many Newbery Medal winners are infamous tragedies, or at least lean to the sad side. Johnny Tremaine, Bridge to Terabithia, Shiloh, you get the idea. This was even parodied in another children's book, No More Dead Dogs by Gordon Corman, where the main character says, quote, "Pick up any book with a dog and an award sticker on the cover. Trust me, that dog is going down." Unquote. But the reason I wanted to look at Newbery winners is precisely because the award has this literary cachet. Obviously, there are a lot of other worthy books out there, and I've already done several episodes about children's sci-fi. But the ones with that award sticker still are more likely to be read in schools. Grown-ups, especially teachers, think they're worthwhile and important to read in schools. And that means they're also more likely to be read across generations, where a lot of children's sci-fi isn't. I've talked about this before as well. You don't see a lot of children's sci-fi from the past, both because there wasn't as much of it pre-2000, but also because it doesn't stay on the shelves very long like adult sci-fi does. 25 years ago, all the kids were reading Animorphs, myself included. Today, nobody is. But they're still reading A Wrinkle in Time. And they'll probably still be reading A Wrinkle in Time 25 years from now. All this is to say that I wanted to look at the past Newbery winners in sci-fi to see if we could learn anything from them. Are there any patterns to the books that made the cut? Let's find out. In the long history of the Newbery Medal, the prize has been awarded 102 times, and unless I miscounted pretty badly, 6 of them have been awarded to science fiction books. There was A Wrinkle in Time in 1963, Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH in 1972, The Giver in 1994, When You Reach Me in 2010, Flora and Ulysses in 2014, and finally The Last Cuentista in 2022. It's a short list. I feel like part of this goes back to the tension with literary fiction, which is often perceived to be superior in some way to genre fiction. But with children's lit, I think it's a bit more subtle. Again, there's that factor of grown-ups, parents, teachers, and librarians deciding what kinds of books they want kids to read. Which is fine, it's usually done for some good reasons, but they aren't necessarily the kinds of books kids would choose for themselves. To wit, if you look at the past Newbery winners, you see a lot of historical fiction, a lot of coming-of-age stories, and a lot of stories about diverse cultures. All good things to learn, 2 of them things that can overlap with science fiction, but not things that are closely associated with science fiction. If you think kinds of books that librarians recommend to kids to read, which ultimately is what the Newbery Medal is, sci-fi is not the first thing that comes to mind. So again, my question is, what is special about the books that won it? Also, I should mention that, like the Hugos and Nebulas, the runners-up for the Newbery Award can be just as important, and I did read some of those runners-up in school. But that would make it several times more complicated, and I don't have time to go through the whole corpus. The first thing I noticed with this book list is that it follows the children's sci-fi genre as a whole, with increasing numbers of works over time. There weren't any sci-fi winners in the first 40 years of the award, back when pretty much the only children's sci-fi author who's still remembered today was Robert Heinlein. Then there were 3 of them in the next 40 years, but then there have been 3 more winners just since 2010. That makes me a bit more hopeful for the future. As children's sci-fi has become more widespread, the literary world has taken notice and not just relegated it. On the other hand, the second thing I noticed is that these books lean decidedly towards soft science fiction or even fantasy. That's also unsurprising. Fantasy has always been quite a bit more popular for the Newbery Medal than sci-fi. I'll discuss the books in more detail in a minute, but briefly, A Wrinkle in Time is very clearly science fantasy with a strong religious aspect. The Giver is also science fantasy, and in fact was criticized by some sci-fi fans as being pure fantasy. Flora and Ulysses is a superhero story that doesn't even try to be rigorous. It's just traumatic backstory equals superhero. Why wouldn't it? When You Reach Me is a cross-genre book, and it's mainly a mystery. The sci-fi part is largely in the background. And Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH doesn't have anything directly fantastical, but it leans hard into the fantasy tropes, talking animals and the like. It reads more like a modernization of a fantasy story than a straight sci-fi story. That leaves only the last Cuentista, the most recent of the 6, as anything like a true hard sci-fi story, which makes me a bit less optimistic about the genre. It leaves me wondering how well it can really compete. Now, the first 3 of these books I have mentioned before in the earlier episodes about children's sci-fi, but let's take a quick look at them in this new context. I want to start with Robert C. O'Brien's Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, because that one is the clear outlier of the group. 4 of the other 5 books are coming-of-age stories, and in all of them, the protagonist is a preteen or young teenager. But in Mrs. Frisby, the protagonist is a middle-aged mother of 4, and also a mouse. Also, it's worth noting that in 5 of the 6 books, the protagonist is female, although that could be statistics of small numbers. This suggests to me that Mrs. Frisby falls more into the category of fun adventure story, where the talking animals have to survive the humans that are disrupting their world, and there's not a whole lot deeper about it. Like I said, it reads more like a scientific fantasy story. You could just as easily tell it with the rats being magical, or for that matter, you could tell it like Watership Down, which has some similarities, except that the rabbits are ostensibly just ordinary rabbits with no enhancement at all. Either way, fun adventure stories do win awards at times, but in this case, it seems to be the minority. Meanwhile, Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time is much more of a coming-of-age story, and also a proto-dystopia, with Meg Murray having to save her brother from the oppressive power of it. Actually, that's another common thread. 3 of the 6 winners on this list are either dystopias or dystopia light. I've complained before, and I'm not the only one, about how young adult fiction is riddled with dystopias, so I'm not enthusiastic about the fact that the ALA has rated them so highly in handing out its awards. But A Wrinkle in Time is also an outlier in that the characters only visit the dystopia, and even more so for a different reason, that it is an overtly religious book. Overtly religious stories in sci-fi are already uncommon, and what's more, I think it's a book that could not be written as easily today as it was in 1962. While I think it still holds up well, a book where Christianity is verifiably true in story is one that I don't think would be as widely successful with a modern multicultural audience. Although, see also The Chronicles of Narnia. Next, Lois Lowry's The Giver is the most traditional dystopia on the list, with Jonas being raised in an oppressive society, his eyes being opened to how bad it is when he comes of age in that society's terms, and then hatching a plan to escape it. Honestly, I've talked about dystopia so much, including this one, that I feel like I don't have a lot to add here. I'll only note that all 3 of the dystopian stories on the list are the less dramatic kind, where the primary goal is escape. There's no Katniss Everdeen coming back to overthrow the government. I don't know if that's just coincidence, if it's secondary to the younger protagonists, or related, if the realism of a 13-year-old kid not being a world-class revolutionary was more appealing to the committee. But it is what it is. Anyway, the real reason I wanted to make this episode was to cover the 3 newer sci-fi books that have won the Newbery Medal in the 21st century. Because if I had to bet money on which children's sci-fi books of today will be widely read 20 years from now, based on history alone, I'd bet on these 3. The first of the three is When You Reach Me, written by Rebecca Stead in 2009. Like I said, this is a weird genre crossover kind of story. It starts out looking like a slice-of-life literary fiction story about Miranda Sinclair, a girl from a struggling New York family attending 6th grade while her mother is training to win big on the game show The $20,000 Pyramid. This part, minus the game show, was heavily based on Rebecca Stead's own childhood in New York in the 70s. But then, things take a turn, as Miranda begins to receive strange notes in impossible places, and things start oddly going missing, leading the book to become a mystery story. Yet, as time goes on, things grow even stranger, as the notes seem to predict the future, and it becomes increasingly clear that something supernatural is going on. Ultimately, it's revealed that the notes were sent by a time traveler who has come back in time to prevent a tragedy. And yet, to me, the book felt much more like the original slice-of-life literary fiction story, just with a sci-fi flair. The focus remains on Miranda as she struggles with her best friend becoming distant while also making new friends with people she previously disliked. You know, normal kid stuff. There are definite sci-fi themes and ideas in there, but in my mind, they, and even the mystery part, were pretty strongly relegated to the B-plot. It was a good story, but it didn't feel like a sci-fi story. Next up, we have Flora and Ulysses, written by Kate DiCamillo in 2013. DiCamillo was already famous for Because of Winn-Dixie, which was adapted into a movie in 2005, and another Newbery winner, the fantasy novel The Tale of Despereaux. I talked about Flora and Ulysses in episode 16 of this season when I discussed its movie adaptation, but I thought the book was considerably better. It wasn't the greatest, I'm not a fan of DiCamillo's style, but it was put together quite a bit better, and it definitely understood its message better. In the story, Ulysses is a squirrel who gained superpowers and human-like intelligence after being accidentally run over by a vacuum cleaner. Because that's how it works in comic books, so why not? He's rescued by a young girl named Flora, a self-described cynic who has a contentious relationship with her mother, who in turn has a contentious relationship with her ex-husband, Flora's father. And that's pretty much it. Ulysses has to figure out his powers and prove his worth to the main antagonist, who is Flora's mother. This story is very much a family drama, with the main conflict being Flora and her mother fighting, but ultimately coming to better understand each other with Ulysses' help. The movie, in contrast, seemingly either didn't want to go there, or didn't think it was interesting enough. So it invented the new antagonist of the crazy, rabies-obsessed animal control guy out of whole cloth, resolved the book's conflict halfway through, and added a new subplot of rescuing Ulysses from the animal control building. And to be honest, it was a lot harder for me to take it seriously. Regardless, Flora and Ulysses is a superhero story, which is already kind of peripheral to sci-fi. And beyond that, it felt like more of a commentary on superhero stories amidst the backdrop of family drama, so I don't consider it to be strongly sci-fi overall. Finally, the most recent sci-fi book to win a Newbery Medal was The Last Cuentista by Donna Barba Higuera. That's Barba, not Barbara, which was published in 2021 and won the medal just last year in 2022. And for the first time, we actually have a heavily sci-fi-centric book in the top spot. And indeed, a hard sci-fi book. To my knowledge, there's nothing in this book that's truly impossible, although there are a fair number of things that are improbable. And the sci-fi parts of the story are front and center. The story begins with the end of the world. In the year 2061, we learn that Halley's Comet has been knocked off course by a solar flare and is going to collide with Earth with just a few months of warning. For the record, this is the part that I found most implausible. For an unknown, newly discovered comet on a collision course with Earth, we would get a few months to a couple years of warning, much like in the movie Don't Look Up. And at that point, it would probably be difficult to deflect it away from Earth, even with the technology of 2061. However, with a known comet, like Halley's Comet, we already know its orbit. We'd either see that it was on a possible collision course with Earth when it was outbound from the Sun in 1986, giving us 75 years of warning, or it would get knocked directly onto its collision course when it swung behind the sun as seen from Earth, and we'd only get a few weeks of warning, like a less dumb version of Armageddon. But let's take the Halley's Comet bit at face value. To preserve the human species, a few hundred humans are trying to escape Earth in search of a new solar system on 3 luxury space liners that have been converted to sleeper ships. One of these humans is Petra Peña, a half-Mexican girl who has been recruited to be sleep-trained as a botanist while she's in hibernation, but is really more interested in listening to her grandmother's stories that were passed down from her ancestors. Unfortunately, the survivor arcs are hijacked by an authoritarian group called the Collective, who are... I don't think I can really pin down their ideology, but they're definitely eugenicist, seemingly trying to perfect humans by genetic engineering and killing off anyone who's not useful. And they have this Year Zero style ideology where they want to erase all knowledge of history so they can wipe away the corruption of the past and build a better future or some such nonsense. When Petra wakes up, she discovers that everyone else is brainwashed by the Collective with no memory of the past, or dead, and she has become the last Cuentista. In English, the last storyteller. The last person who remembers the old stories of Earth. And so, she quickly realizes that she has to save the remaining survivors of the Sleepers and escape from the Collective to their new planet. To be honest, I was not enthused about this book going in. I read the blurb on the back cover and I thought, oh, another YA dystopia? But it's not exactly, I think. It's more of a jailbreak plot when you get right down to it. Petra wakes up as a prisoner in a bad place, and things move pretty quickly after that for her to get away. It's a dystopia, yes, but it's used in a different way. Kind of like how A Wrinkle in Time does. So I think it works out. Now, what have I learned from all this? I don't know for sure. I pointed out the main trends at the beginning. Successful, cross-generational children's lit is, I don't want to say gatekept, because kids can popularize stories on their own, but let's say encouraged in a particular direction by adults, especially the adults who give out awards and set reading assignments. Many of these are good books, but I think there's a definite trend where coming-of-age stories and stories that teach real-world lessons, even if in allegorical form, are the most encouraged. And perhaps because of that, until recently, the science of science fiction has not been a major focus. With the success of The Last Cuentista, I'm hopeful that it signals a shift in the genre. It's certainly what Heinlein was going for when he half-created the genre back in the 50s, but only time will tell. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn and is available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter and Mastodon at SciMeetsFiction, and my website is sciencemeetsfiction.com. For my book recommendation of the episode, none of these books really spoke to me in a standout way. I did enjoy Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim a lot as a kid, and even read the sequels, and I already recommended A Wrinkle in Time. But for this episode, I feel I would be remiss if I did not recommend The Last Cuentista. As a rare example of hard sci-fi for kids done well, I think it's worth a closer look for kids and adults alike. And there's one other reason. For the next episode, I am pleased to announce that I have interviewed Donna Barba Higuera, the author of The Last Cuentista. We had a lot of fun recording it, and I think it turned out really well, so be sure to come back for that. Thanks for listening.